Welcome everyone. Welcome to Drupal 8 for Decision Makers. Brought to you by Form 1, this webinar will focus on budgets, bosses, and all the BS standing between you and this next world-class CMS. And so with that, let's get started.
Welcome, everyone, to Drupal 8 Jeopardy! I'm your host, Andrew Cohen, and when I'm not hosting this game show, I serve as Managing Director of Digital Strategy at Form 1, which is a digital agency in Washington, D.C. Let's meet our contestants. Our first contestant is Jess Schneider. Hello, Jess.
Hi, Andrew.
Jess is a Senior Manager of Web Systems at WETA, the leading public broadcasting station in our nation's capital. And our next contestant is Chaz Chumley. Hello, Chaz.
Hello, Andrew.
Chaz is a technical architect at Form 1 and author of the new book, Drupal 8 Theming with Twig. So let's get to our first question. So for our category is Drupal 8, and the answer for $200 is mobile in its DNA. Jeff?
What is being able to edit content on your phone?
Correct. And our next answer for $100 is sexier and more usable backend.
What is a Drupal 8 content authoring experience?
Great, that's correct as well. And like all of our answers in this category, we are using actual language provided by the Drupal Association describing Drupal 8. Our next answer is for $300. The answer is not an orchestra.
What is the Symfony 2 framework?
Correct. And then for $400, the answer is your developers will wet themselves. Jess?
What is object-oriented PHP?
That is correct as well. So let's move on, and before we break out the diapers, let's dig a little deeper into Drupal 8's new features. Chaz?
Thanks, Andrew. So obviously we're here to talk about Drupal 8. So there's been a lot of hype related to Drupal 8's release, and as a Drupalist, I'm excited about the new features. But before we all get pretty geeky, there's really lots of things for everyone to get excited about. First is simplicity for editors. Okay, the ability for editors now to be able to have a WYSIWYG in place when they first go in, the ability to do cool things with images, inline images, add captions, all these things that editors before had to have somebody as a site builder or as a developer go in and set up before they even had the ability to even start authoring content. The next thing is more power for administrators. Just what administrators always want, more power. Now they actually have it. They have the ability to do a lot of cool things inside of Drupal 8. A lot of stuff that's been moved, that was currently in contributed modules has now been moved into core. Things such as the views for doing aggregation and listing. Things such as multilingual, migration, configuration management. Lots of different cool features that you always found yourself in Drupal 7 having to go grab a handful of contributed modules, install them, configure them. All that power now is there available for administrators. And finally, the most exciting one is accessibility for everyone. With the new Twig templating structure that's in place, we now actually have the ability to actually have true HTML5, the ability to add areas and roles, and the ability to have visibility and different settings that just make Drupal 8 in itself a lot more accessible. The next thing I want to talk about, since obviously I'm a technical architect and I do like to get a little bit in the weeds and talk geeky, then this might be of interest to those that are dealing with technical management team or developers themselves, is Drupal 8 is every object-oriented developer's dream. We have this brand new API. Okay, we've taken the best content management system and married it with the best PHP framework in Symfony. So such features as Symfony, Composer that follow these lovely PSR standards allow us to have a much more mature framework with reusable components. such thing as YAML configuration that allows for standardized data serialization, object-oriented PHP with facades, dependency injection, and more. Now, while all these things get us off the island, they might be just leaving you scrambling to look up these new terms. Why is that? Because, well, while Drupal 8 is the next best thing for content management systems with all of the lovely baked-in object-oriented developer tools, it is going to be harder to learn. It also lacks some really good examples and documentation unless you know where to look. And it might also require you to ramp up now or start looking for training or training your staff to get more into object-oriented PHP development. The next best thing that we have in Drupal 8 is these awesome new features called custom block layouts. Finally, almost everything in Drupal 8 is considered to be a block. So what does that mean? That means that we now have the ability to reuse blocks. We have the ability to make blocks fieldable since they are considered entities. And we also have the ability to create these custom blocks that can handle most use cases. So custom content types along with custom blocks allow us to achieve a lot more functionality and ability to display content in ways that we weren't able to do before without contributing modules. But what you may not know is that blocks are still somewhat limited when it comes to ordering them within the same region. You also may find the need to still utilize panels or page manager or contributing modules to handle specific use cases. One thing to keep in mind is panels is not yet ready for production. It is getting closer. Hopefully within the next 90 days we'll probably see page manager and panels be available, but the layout plugin that it does utilize is part of core. So while there's no UI to actually use for this, you do have the ability from a developer standpoint to start creating some different layouts. The next thing, and this is really exciting for content editors, is that we now have the ability to have WYSIWYG out of the box. No more configuring an editor. We actually have this the minute we actually open up the Drupal installation. And what this is this CK editor in core. This gives us a better editing experience. The ability to create inline images with captions, the ability to put in markup the way that we want it to look, and actually have it look like that on the front end of the actual website that you're building. But what if you want to configure CK Editor to allow the addition of things like font awesome, HTML elements outside of the normal HTML markup that you might want to put in? Well, one of the things that you may not know is that it's not really the full version of CK Editor. It's close, but it's a lot less configurable, than what you were used to in Drupal 7. So in order to extend things, you must know how to create CK Editor and module plugins. So it's something to keep in mind if you're really wanting to harness the CK Editor and the WYSIWYG capabilities that are in Drupal 8. Configuration management. This is one of those nice things if you're dealing with a dev and staging environment. We now have the ability to do single and full site synchronization between environments with the ability to import and export both whole sites or just specific items such as views, content types, display modes, and more. However, this is really targeted for a development workflow that has dev and staging in mind, and it's not really built for site instances. Okay, there's also a lack of configuration options since it's built mostly for site admins, but developers might still really need to harness feature module to continue with familiar workflow, but a lot of the stuff that is in features that was pulled out and put into configuration management. So as long as you familiarize yourself with YAML configuration and how configuration management handles the settings, you should be perfect. Twig. This is probably the most exciting one that I've actually had the ability to actually really deep dive in with. Just got done writing a Drupal 8 theming with Twig book, and what Twig templating gives us is a flexible, fast, and secure PHP templating engine. And gone is the TPL templates of old, and in place is a new, friendlier syntax for designers. It also provides better security so that we don't accidentally delete the database from a template. It's also much easier to learn and very extensible. No more having to guess what Drupal is going to output because we're actually getting the markup that we're expecting to see in the template, and we also have the ability to debug variables and output them to the page. This is great because this provides template naming suggestions right in the markup, so we know exactly what templates core is using and how we want to overwrite those. One thing to keep in mind, though, is there is some shortfalls with this because you still need to use pre-processing to create or modify variables. Not as much in the theme layer as it used to be, but still something to keep in mind. Also, the lack of documentation on the theme API with strong examples on how to do more complex things is very minimal at this point. And the documentation is getting much better, but you can actually go over to Sensio Labs and take a look at the Twig template documentation there, and it should give you a really good idea of how to utilize it right now with Drupal 8. Finally, we have everything we pretty much need in core. Everyday items such as views, multilingual capabilities, migration, configuration, and another exciting one, RESTful web services, the ability to start developing headless applications with Drupal 8 as the backend. But what you might not know is the contributor modules that your site may be currently relying on may have no roadmap for upgrading them. So you need to take a long look at what you're currently using. But in most cases, you can either develop a custom module, which may require some rebuilding because of the Symfony and new Drupal API and OOP principles. Also, integration points may need to be rethought or rebuilt. But like I said, everything that you pretty much need to do 80% of your websites nowadays is in core. So now you may be stressing over what should you do, asking how you and your team are ever going to learn all this new stuff, all this new terminology. Well, our first advice to you is don't panic. Andrew is going to help you calm your nerves.
Thanks, Jazz. So I think when it comes to thinking about Drupal 8, one important thing to keep in mind is that you are far from alone. And let's talk about what that really means. This graph is something you can find on Drupal.org. It shows the number of websites that have been reported that they're using any version of Drupal, and it also breaks it down by version. So the top line is the total number of sites that are reporting that they're, or the total sites running Drupal. The brown line below it is the total sites running Drupal 7, and then far below it is a blue line for Drupal 6. So there's over 1 million sites running Drupal 7 today, which is more than all previous versions combined. And all of those sites, those 1 million websites, have to be assessed, they have to be budgeted, they all have to be deployed, so they all have a long project timeline still until they're ready for 8. So you're not alone there. And then look at the bottom of the graph. You'll see near the baseline there's this orange line, that little with a little blip at the end on the right. That's Drupal 8, and you can see that it's just now finally starting to increase with the release last month of Drupal 8. There's only about 50,000 sites running Drupal 8 right now. So what does that mean for the future? So here's a hypothetical graph that we borrowed from Angie Byron's webinar last May. It's a really good webinar that we recommend you check out because it goes through in more detail all the new features in Drupal 8. But in there, she showed kind of, this is a way to think about it. We're basically different adoption and abandonment rates for Drupal 8 and Drupal 7, respectively. So right now, we're at the beginning of this early adopter bucket over on the left. And there's some brave souls that have already started to build production sites, but really, momentum is just starting. So at some point, the Drupal 8 line, again, this is a hypothetical graph, but at some point the graph I showed on the previous slide is going to look more like this, and you're going to see the Drupal 8 line in brown cross the blue Drupal 7 line below. And then that's a point where majority of people are going to be moving to Drupal 8. So as a decision maker, it's your job to be sure you're ready for whenever those lines meet. And I guess our best guess right now is probably it's still going to be at least a year away. Meanwhile, there's a whole host of big brands that are on Drupal 7. So you can be reassured that however complex your site, there's probably a corporate site that's many times more complicated that still has to be worked out. So all of these big brands are on Drupal, Whole Foods, WTA, American Red Cross, and then 71 of the top 100 universities, roughly a quarter of all .gov sites are now on Drupal. So these are complex sites, lots of modules, lots of integrations, lots of hurdles. In most cases, a lot of these projects not only have not been budgeted, but they haven't been procured. And so that all has to happen. And you know how slow government can work at times. And so we're working right now on a big replatforming for a big government agency. We're in the process of moving them from an old CMS Documentum, as it were, to Drupal 7. We'll probably be done totally moving them to Drupal 7 sometime around the time Drupal 9 comes out. So in short, you're likely fine where you are unless you're on Drupal 6, and we'll talk about that more in a second. We have good, mature software. The software's stable. It's flexible. It's really well understood. And we're kind of at this moment where all the software, the expertise, and the infrastructure are all really strong. So like we're in a nice place where if you're on Drupal 7 now, you're very much in the mainstream. Also, there's, in the past year, all of us are aware that there's been a number of high-profile hacks. And so with that, the commercial folks and some of the government folks who are using Drupal are really giving new attention to security, which is going to lead to those customers pressuring their vendors to ensure that their Drupal solutions remain secure as long as they need. And as we know, agencies sometimes hold on to tech too long, so they're going to be continuing to pressure to make sure that Drupal 7s continue to be patched and secure for a good while. And with that, there's also a nice toolkit of functionality for you to enhance your current Drupal 7 site. And with that, one thing to communicate to your other folks in your organization is that, like, right now you're basically reaping the harvest of your investment. So if you've invested tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands in a Drupal solution, right now you're reaping the benefits of that solution, and you want to do that for as long as you reasonably can. The trouble of extending or modifying Drupal 7 is never going to be less costly than it is right now. So I guess like a side comment is that if you're thinking about doing something interesting, there's no better time than the present to get started. You shouldn't be paused just because you're waiting on Drupal 8. And you kind of think about it like if you are using a car that's a couple years old, all of the mechanics understand it and have good parts for it. It's one of those new cars that have just come off the line where they may not have parts just yet for something. And that's where we are right now. Everyone has parts for Drupal 7, but not yet for Drupal 8. So time's generally on your side. Our feeling is that not only is Drupal still cheaper for now, but a site that you might launch on Drupal 7 in 2016 won't likely need to be upgraded to Drupal 8 for security reasons or something like that until sometime around 2019. So you have a bit of time there. And you also don't want to be the very first site that your staff or your vendor builds on Drupal 8, unless you're super skilled. And you also can kind of take solace in the fact that by picking an open source platform, that means that your timeline for the platform is going to be set by real world factors, your own mission priorities, and you're not going to be tied to like some arbitrary software company's business plan. So let's run through a couple scenarios real quick. One would be you're on Drupal 6. If you're on Drupal 6, you do need to move quickly. You have less than 3 months now in which Drupal 6 will continue to be supported from a security standpoint. And also, if you're on Drupal 6, you're probably working in an organization where, let's be honest, you're not an early adopter. So what you should do is not worry about 8. Move to 7 right now. Let's say you're on Drupal 7. So we talked about the fact you have time, you can watch and wait, but also the core modules, as Chaz was talking about a few minutes ago, those aren't all updated, but the existing ones in Drupal 7 will, in theory, be continued to be supported and patched until Drupal 9 is released in a couple years. But we should also recognize that, like, for some of the more popular modules, those aren't going to be, they're not going to be getting as much attention as they were. Developer interest is going to wane. So that's something to keep in mind as well. If you have deep technical expertise in-house or you're working with a highly trusted vendor, you could still wait pretty comfortably until late 2016 to begin the development phase of your project, but you certainly could begin a discovery or planning project now. You might choose to move a little more quickly to 8 if you have some specific needs, and I'll dive into that in a few minutes. The other scenario is maybe you're starting a new project and you are kind of undecided on whether to go to 7 or maybe to go on 8. If you're starting the next 6 months, unless you meet some specific criteria, you probably should start with C7 right now and not wait for 8. If you're starting a new project and you have a discretionary timeline where you could consider delaying the development work until sometime middle to late next year, then you could start building Drupal 8 into your planning. But in other cases, there's not a lot of reason to jump to 8 if you're starting a project like in January. There's other considerations, like say your site has some serious other issues, like maybe it's not even responsive, in which it's not showing up highly in Google's ranking results for that reason, or maybe it has just terrible usability. In those cases, you're losing audience right now, so waiting for 8 isn't going to help you. Your audience cares about the quality of the site that you have. They don't care what software is running underneath. So you should get moving on your project, move to Drupal 7 now. So here's a couple scenarios where you might want to move to Drupal 8 more quickly. So say you have very limited integrations, like you aren't integrating with CRM, you don't have an LDAP integration, you're not using the Salesforce module. That would be a good case where you could consider doing a project on 8. Say you don't have custom workflows. You're not using Workbench, you're not using other moderation modules. That would also be a check mark for using Drupal 8 now. Also, if you have no community, you're not using organic groups, then you could be considering 8. Or say you're not using any of the drag and drop functionality like module or like the panels module or panelizer. If none of those are true, then 8 could be a good choice for you. And my esteemed colleague, Kurt Volker, has a great blog post on forum1.com that goes through kind of these scenarios in more detail about when you might choose to move to 8 now. Also, there's a couple other reasons that are pretty specific that might make 8 a good choice for you right now. One would be, as Chaz was talking about a moment ago, the multilingual support in 8 is a lot stronger. So, and by sophisticated multilingual, I mean, you're not like just translating one page or a section, you're actually, the entire site is available in multiple languages. If you're one of those folks and you're starting a new project, then you might look into 8 more seriously. 8 offers, instead of, there were approximately 30 modules related to multilingual, it replaces all of those with just about 3 modules. They're included in core, so they're right there when you install. Another scenario might be you're involved in a project or something about your work requires a particular module and you need to accelerate that development. Then you might want to move to 8 more quickly because then you can support that need, you can help support the development of that module, and you can guide the trajectory of that module's development. And then a final scenario where you might want to move to 8 more quickly is if you're involved in RESTful apps. So a signature improvement of Drupal 8 is its improved support for web services. Drupal is now a much more interesting choice if you're looking for a platform that pushes and pulls data from a variety of devices that may or may not have a browser, like think Apple Watch or something like that. So if you're dabbling in emerging technology and innovative solutions such as these, then Drupal 8 might be a good place to start your project. So otherwise, most of us can stick with what we've got for the moment and make our plans instead. So let's dive a little bit more into planning. But with this context in mind, Jess is going to bring things down to earth for us for a little bit. Jess?
Thank you. So I am the in-house developer, among other things, for WETA, which is the flagship public broadcasting station for Washington, D.C. I joined the organization in 2002 and started working on WETA.org specifically in about 2007. And if you've been in the Drupal community for any length of time, you might remember that this was just as Drupal 6 was being released. So one of my very first tasks was to make this a similar decision. Should we relaunch our website in Drupal 5 or Drupal 6? At that time, we chose Drupal 5 because it was the more stable and mature option, but we planned to move to Drupal 6 once Contrib had caught up. So it's a very similar situation to what people who are facing now, trying to decide between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. The problem we ran into is that while we spent several years reaping all of those rewards that Andrew mentioned for choosing the more stable and mature option, the problem is that we got stuck. Drupal 5 reached end of life and stopped being supported in 2011, and we were still on Drupal 5. And we were unable to finally make the leap to Drupal 7 until November of 2013. So even over a year later, when Andrew first approached me about possibly joining him and Chaz for this presentation, I was still sort of in recovery from that experience. So my immediate response was, really? You want me to be thinking about Drupal 8? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I was actually already in the process of making the decision about when we were going to move to 8. It's here. Ignoring it isn't productive. So in my role at WETA, I am either directly responsible for or at least serve in an advisory capacity for all of WETA's Drupal sites. That includes weta.org. We have additionally a couple of local blogs that are on Drupal 7. The program site for Washington Week with Gwen Eiffel is on Drupal 7. And we have several nationally focused websites on educational issues. And so my primary responsibility is weta.org and the local blogs. Even for the sites I don't have that primary responsibility for, my colleagues are going to be looking to me for leadership on this issue. So my job, as I see it, is to figure out if and when we should make the leap and upgrade to Drupal 8. So the major takeaway I took from the Drupal 5 to Drupal 7 migration experience is that going between major versions is a rebuild, not an upgrade. And reframing the project in this way really helped to move it along. So that is how I'm going to be framing any internal conversations at WETA about moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. So there are three main areas for this. The first is code. All of those changes that Chaz was talking about earlier mean that unless you have the simplest of sites, you can't just upgrade core and call it a day. And WETA.org in particular is not a simple website. The second area is design. Even if you're planning to stick with the new design and you're not planning to refresh it at all, you're still going to need to retheme the entire site to use the new templating system. And finally, content. The migrate module is now in core, which is awesome, and that is totally going to help, but it's not a silver bullet. My content is probably going to need some massaging depending on how much support the various contrib modules I'm using have for the migrate module. And how it's structured currently may be different from how I want to structure it in the new site. And in that case, there's going to need to be some sort of transition between the two systems. So knowing that this is going to be a site rebuild, I know that there are certain hurdles that I'm going to need to jump before I can decide if we're ready for Drupal 8. Some of these hurdles are institutional. We got stuck on Drupal 5 for so long in part because the decision makers in my organization are used to proprietary software where upgrades just happen. So when money got really tight during the recession, they weren't willing to allocate the resources necessary. Some of these hurdles are Drupal specific. I don't know how many contrib modules your sites use, but mine use a boatload. So do I wait until they've all been ported? That was kind of what got us in trouble last time, so I don't think that's the best plan. So what I may end up doing instead is wait until there's a critical mass of functionality, which is separate from specific modules, but the functionality, see if that exists in Drupal 8, and then start the rebuild under the assumption that that last mile will come, either through contrib or by building custom functionality myself. And third, some hurdles are organization or business specific. For example, functionality that is core to your business model or mission that your site cannot launch without. So in my case, that functionality is that my site supports a television station, and believe it or not, some folks still like to watch television over the air in real time, so need a television schedule. So I need to be able to display that. Currently, it runs off of a custom Drupal 7 module that I built. I am going to need to port that to Drupal 8 before I can even consider launching the new site. But it's really important for me to figure out how to jump all of these hurdles because there are significant opportunities that come with the rebuild, specifically the chance to rethink and reorganize the site. So I need to look at what I've learned as my Drupal 7 site has lived and grown and improve upon it. So are my content types still getting the job done? Have I and my content editors perhaps discovered pain points as we edit and update the site that could be smoothed out? Have we discovered that certain bits of functionality that we thought were incredibly important aren't anymore? Have there been changes in best practices? Have new modules come on the scene for Drupal 8 that better accomplish what we're trying to do than our current solution? And have we added new elements to the site in a piecemeal fashion that might be better served by tighter integration? Alternatively, are there sections of the site that are siloed and might be better served as standalone subsites? For example, weta.org has two sections of the site that are really good examples. Our press room and our station relations area. Both of these sections require moderated authentication for users to fully access all of the available resources, which adds significant overhead to the site, but it isn't required anywhere else. So breaking those two sections off into their own mini site might be a good plan. It would make the overall project more manageable by reducing the amount of functionality and modules needed, and at the same time it would give me low-risk practice with Drupal 8 before tackling my primary fully public-facing websites. So remember this slide? WIDA is solidly in the majority bucket. We need the support of a solid community base before we can make the move, but we don't want to wait so long that we're stuck in an unsupported, insecure purgatory as we were with Drupal 5. In real terms, this probably means that now that there's a stable release, I can start playing with it and perhaps doing smaller chunks of site building. Our local blogs are fairly simple, and so it would probably be a good test case, or maybe try spinning off the press room and the station relations area I mentioned earlier, just to start getting a feel for how Drupal 8 works and what the best practices are. Then I'll be ready to tackle our main site, probably a year or so from now. So this has been looking at the decision from a fairly technical perspective, but even if you're technologically ready, you can't actually make the move until you've convinced your boss, which is what Andrew is going to talk about now.
Thanks, Jess. So far we've been looking at this from this decision from a fairly technical perspective, but even if you're technologically ready, you can't really make the move yet. So let's talk through the fact that how we go about that. And first thing to recognize is that a few minutes ago we were talking about how you have time, but you can't be complacent either. So the main thing you want to be doing now is planning. So the first thing you want to do is think about the platform, and the Drupal Association probably won't like us saying this, but Drupal isn't the solution to everything. It's a framework like a lot of things. It runs on an extremely popular stack. But if Drupal's direction with 8 is no longer in line with your organization's needs, that's okay. I mean, there's a lot of other solutions. Your site might not be as complicated as some of the ones we've been, as WETA or other solutions we've been talking about. So if your content and your integration needs are simple, or you don't have complicated workflows, there's a lot of different other solutions you could choose to do. We do a fair amount of work in WordPress. We also work with a number of PHP-based application frameworks. So there's a lot of reasons why you might want to just take a quick look at your platform in general. And the advantages and disadvantages of Drupal vis-a-vis other platforms is kind of a whole other topic for another webinar. But this is something important to keep in mind. And one thing also to consider is that if you move off Drupal, as you diversify your technical platforms, you are sometimes left with technical overhead and debt and technical debt if you continue to support Drupal solutions for other sites you might manage. So you got to be careful there too.